Welcome to the ETF Show, taped right here at the New York Stock Exchange. I'm your host, Kristen Myers, ETF Editor-in-Chief for Asset TV. Now, I'm sure many investors know by now that if you want to invest like a member of Congress, there is an ETF for that. Two, in fact. We have Nancy, NANC, that's the Unusual Whales Subversive Democratic Trading ETF, and GOP, the Unusual Whales Subversive Republican Trading ETF, which helps you trade like Democratic and Republican politicians, respectively. But with midterms looming and the potential of new predictive market ETFs, politics are becoming more investable than ever. Here to discuss more, Senior Portfolio Manager Dan Weiskopf. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, as I was just mentioning, there are these two ETFs under Subversive ETFs, Nancy and GOP. I absolutely love the names. And now we have these new predictive ETFs that have been filed for with the SEC. Then that's going to be where people can essentially pick who they think is even going to win the midterm election. So I'm curious to know why you think politics has become such an investable theme.
It's a great question. There's at least 6 or 10 reasons. First and foremost, my history goes back to earlier than 1999 when full disclosure was a big thing, meaning that everybody was required to get the same disclosure at the same time. Well, politicians may have an edge. And if you think through the fact that they also control policy and regulation, they definitely have an edge, right? And so there are a lot of reasons why I believe when you follow how they trade and what they buy and what they sell in the way of specific stocks, you can get outperformance. And candidly, that's what's been happening in the ETFs.
So then the philosophy for these two ETFs isn't just, well, actually, I'm curious, is it just that these politicians might have some sort of insider advantage or information, or do you think that there's actually people that are actually trading around political sentiment as well?
Yes, and yes, and yes. Insightful information, maybe inside information, um, and they do move markets. Candidly, when Nancy Pelosi puts on a trade, it's released 45 days later, and you can see that stock going up, a lot as a result of that. You can also wonder whether or not they chatter amongst themselves, right, ahead of time. It's a clubby environment. Let's be honest about it, right? And I think they have good information. Let's just put it that way.
I'm curious to know, what have you learned since the fund's launched about how the politicians invest? That might be different from, the average retail investor.
Well, in the case of GOP specifically, this year we're up 20%, which is twice the indexes. And GOP tends to lean towards value. So it's twice what the value index is doing
Right.
even as well, and beating the Qs, which you wouldn't expect to happen. And Nance a little bit behind this year, but the long-term track record's extraordinary.
All right. So I'm curious to know, you were just mentioning, GOP leans more into value. So then there might actually be a difference between the way Democrats and Republicans are
Oh, no,
trading.
there is a material difference. Yeah. So Nance tends to lean more towards growth. And to that point, like almost at 11% weighting in NVIDIA. And we saw early on a lot of the Democrat candidates, or I'm sorry, members of Congress rather, buying into NVIDIA repeatedly. And yes, there's a 2% weighting in GOP in NVIDIA as well, but they're very different funds. And the interesting part about it also is these are mostly 58-year-old people, right? Looking to retire. And so you would expect them to be conservative. They're well-balanced funds, but you wouldn't expect a 60-year-old per se to be 11% weighted in
Right.
NVIDIA.
Right. Do you see, especially as, midterm elections are coming up and then general in a couple years after that, are there any sectors or themes that you really see as some political trades, whether it's defense spending, right? We just had the US-Iran war. well, still ongoing actually, but AI perhaps with the Democrats leaning into growth. Are there, areas that you're seeing a lot of these politicians really gravitating towards?
Well, both funds have overweighted positions in the semis. And you wouldn't necessarily think about the semis um, as value plays, but they were a year ago,
Right.
and so that's part of the reason why I think GOP has done so well. So now what do we do? We're looking for whether they're going to trim back, right? So it's both sides of the trade. The buy is easy, but do we also catch when they start exiting a position?
Right.
Um, and we've seen a little bit of that in Intel, which is a big position in GOP.
So markets have been super reactive to headlines, and especially political headlines, right? Every time President Trump puts something out on Truth Social, the market moves up and down, depending on what he says. I'm curious to know if you think political volatility itself is its own sort of investable.
It becomes self-fulfilling to some
Right.
degree. Yeah. At this point, there's no question about it. Within the social media sphere, what happens is Nancy Pelosi, who puts them on a trade with a very high conviction because they're usually leaps, and that involves leverage, right?
Right.
Um, and so people pile on afterwards, and we will see 3-4% move in the underlying stock as a result of that.
So predictive market ETFs.
Yes.
Oh dear. I'm curious to know your thoughts, right? This would seem right up a subversive ETF alley. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on these binary ETFs.
Well, I'm not going to speak specifically about subversive in that area, but there is going to be a marketplace for these types of ETFs. And as you were mentioning before, they're very specific outcomes, so they can be fun, I think. And then the question becomes how they evolve further with the outcomes that the ETFs wrap the predictive markets in. It's a little bit tricky and technical on how these things might get wrapped. Um, but I think the younger people, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, um, they want instant gratification. They're excited about the betting side of the predictive markets. And so if you think about it in the way of an ETF, you can see the ETF also moving the predictive markets. So it may be even self-fulfilling.
You just use the word betting
I did.
because do you see these as innovation or do you think it's just gambling in an ETF wrapper?
I don't think predictive markets as they are today um, are a savings plan. Um, but having said that, if you have them wrapped in an ETF and they deliver alpha over the S&P 500, why can't they be a savings strategy?
So then it's not just novelty then.
As it stands right now, um, it's more targeted at younger people, like but it isn't necessarily a novelty. Why? Well, here we are at the New York Stock Exchange, and they've made a major investment in the marketplace. So
Do you think over time an ETF like that could become more mainstream where it's not just the Gen Zers that are using these types of ETFs in their portfolios?
thank you for using that word as opposed to the younger people. Um, it will be mainstream because that's what the Gen Zers want, right? The beautiful thing about an ETF wrapper is it can evolve, right? And that's what we've seen over the years. It's wrapping a solution for people to access a theme or an investment strategy. And if that investment strategy works and delivers alpha, money will go there.
Right. So then back to, Nance and GOP. How do you view those types of ETFs, since political ETFs, and I'm sure with the predictive markets, there's going to be even more. How do you view them inside of a portfolio? Considering, as you just mentioned, if it generates alpha, then why can't it be a part of your investment strategy?
Well, I think it
Yeah.
can be. And I think GOP can be viewed as a value strategy, and Nance can be viewed as a growth strategy because they're consistently managed that way. But here's a little bit of a fun information. The interesting part about GOP is that top holdings are JP Morgan and IBIT. You would never think
Oh,
about IBIT, meaning
right,
Bitcoin, as a value-oriented investment.
right.
But
Or that it would even be a top holding inside of GOP.
no, well, there is a lot of interest in crypto by the
Right, right.
Republicans, let's be honest about that. And one of members of Congress, Dave McCormick, who used to be the president of Ray Dalio's firm, Bridgewater, um, did about 18 to 20 buys of the spot ETF, right? And so we kept on buying as a result of that. He's a Republican. It made a lot of sense. And arguably, the interesting part about value orientation is that Bitcoin doesn't have cash flow. I get that. But if you look at the world and the concerns around our debt, it can be justified from a conservative standpoint.
I'm curious to know, how do you weight? Is there a different weighting for different politicians in terms of the moves that they make, or are they all equally weighted, all of the politicians in
We
Congress?
move in 50 basis point increments. Um, so there must be a lot of buying to get to a 10, 11%. But when you have a stock like NVIDIA that over the years has done so extraordinary and you have repeated buying, a lot of that came from appreciation.
Okay. I wasn't sure if certain politicians get more.
It's a great question. We do pay attention to some politicians more than other
Fair. Right,
politicians.
right.
Um, and generally, what you find in both funds is they're large cap, which is a bit of a sad statement by our politicians. You would want them to be also investing in small caps, but they're mostly investing in large caps. It's very consistent about that.
I'm curious to know what some of the biggest misconceptions about these funds are.
That they're like theme or they're kitschy or
Right.
they're novel. I think the biggest misconception is simply that um, we're not following a consistent pattern. Well, what I really love is when I see buying when it's gone against the member of Congress and they just keep buying more. That's a conviction trade. And
Right.
so we'll buy more as well.
Right. I mean, last one for you, just as politics is becoming more and more tradable, what do you think that's going to mean for markets going forward? Because it used to be that markets looked past politics,
Yeah.
and it doesn't seem like they have been lately.
There's so much involved with what's going on in the political world right now. It's hard to look past it. When there's a change in, hypothetically, um, the, the House or the Senate, in terms of Democrats getting greater control over, we'll see what that means for the funds and what happens as far as selling pressure in some of the stocks that were long. It's these funds, and this is a beautiful thing about an ETF wrapper, is it can be viewed also as an information resource.
Right.
So we'll adjust as a result of that.
Do you think that a predictive market ETF could replace the polls, Gallup polls that we've been seeing around election time?
The predictive market
Yeah.
could be, yeah. I don't know if the ETFs will be there yet.
Okay.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I mean, you see it on TV. They're quoted, right?
It is true. I've quoted them
Yeah,
on air
no, well,
before,
why
so
not? And they're very accurate.
yeah. Well, people do say they put their money where their mouth is, right? And in
Exactly.
this case, money where their where their vote is probably going to go.
So if you can't beat them, join them. Look
Yeah.
at the ETFs.
All right, Dan Weiskopf, Senior Portfolio Manager, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you.
today. And thank you for tuning in to the ETF Show.